I often think faith communities simply need just a little bit more human connection. Churches and religious groups of all sorts just need like a pinch more humanity, a touch more social excellence, a smidge more intentional and active effort to connect the people in the pews with each other. When belonging is centered, everything else just seems to be better. When I joined my home church, Justin Spurlock was the person who made me feel that. He offered simple belonging at a time that I needed it. Justin is our guest today, and I can't help but think that this episode is simply like an invitation to everyone inside what a raw and real conversation with Justin and I always sounds like. It's a little bit all over the place. It's a little bit out there. There are moments of clarity, and there's a whole lot of energy between us. Most of my relationship with Justin has been formed in coffee shop conversations or over beers, and he's helped me grow my faith in those settings far more than my faith has ever grown inside the walls of an actual church. I remember once Justin actually took a trip with me to Indiana. We boarded a flight in Denver and went to do some work together in the Midwest. And our conversations on those flights there and back were so filled with what I think was divine energy that I think we were probably, I'm certain we were probably like really annoying to all the other passengers. We were just vibing with each other. We were probably a little loud and we were nerding out about all sorts of weird stuff, and I loved it. So welcome inside our weird and goofy relationship. Thanks for listening to the Between Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Matson, and I'm really glad you're here. I'm delighted to have Pastor Justin Spurlock, my buddy, with me today. Justin is a co-conspirator in half of the things that I do in life and about 100% of the things that I do in the faith world. Justin has helped me with, he has supported me with, he has encouraged me, and between has been as much a product of our conversations and our sacred interactions as anything else. It was born there in a lot of ways. Pastor Justin Spurlock, the lead pastor, lead pastor. What's your official title?
Senior pastor.
Yeah, senior pastor at Grace Presbyterian Church in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, a church that I call one of my church homes, a place that I love to visit and get to build community in. Justin, thanks for being with me.
Hey, I'm delighted to be here, Matt. Thank you. As you know, I love having these conversations. As you say, the space between us is sacred, and there's not a lot of space between you and me right now, as there's this microphone right near us, but it's feeling pretty holy, I'd have to say.
There's no better way to build sacred divine intimacy than to sit really, really close so that the microphone can pick up both of our voices. That's all right, let me get into it. Do you think, listen, a lot of this project, a lot of what we do with Between, a lot of what this podcast is about, is the idea that a conversation, a simple human conversation, a simple human moment of interaction can in fact be sacred. I've said before, I've written before, I've named the unofficial sacrament of conversation, which is probably offensive to some very liturgical and really proper religious folks. But man, I think that this is it, man. Yeah. I think this space right here is about as sacred as it gets. It's about as holy as it gets. Is that wrong? You are a Bible nerd. Teach me that I'm wrong or not.
No, I'm going to teach you that you're right, actually. So all sacraments are about belonging. So the sacrament of baptism is about this sense that you are part of God, that you're part of the people of God, that you're loved, that you are included, right? And the sacrament of communion or Eucharist or Lord's table or whatever people call it within the Christian tradition is the same kind of thing. It's you are welcome here, right? You are loved here. You are transformed here, right? And all sacraments have that at their center, right? And so relationships, conversations, sitting down and having a meal at a table, all of these things are part of that theological trajectory, right? Now, obviously, within all these different denominations and religions and theologies, people have a more strict sense of it, but at the core of it, sacraments are meant to convey to us that we are in, right? And so isn't that what a conversation's about, right? It's letting someone else know that I'm interested in you, that I want to share something with you. I want you to share something with me. And God's been trying to do that since the very beginning, right? When you look at, you take a look at the Bible, right? And at least 3/4 of that thing is shared by 3 major world religions, right? So Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all hold the older part of it, otherwise known as the Hebrew Scriptures, to be the sacred text. And all of it is about God coming and being with human beings and trying to get other human beings to be with other human beings. Yeah. So, come on, that's holy. That's sacred.
I mean, when you started talking about the Eucharist or taking communion, I often, I used to not get that. It felt like a weird show, a weird like snack in the middle of church.
Yeah,
it felt like
can be.
I didn't get it. I mean, I understood the scripture part of it. I understood that Jesus was like, take this and eat it, and take this and drink it, and this is me, and this is. Yeah. I think I had a sense that it was like, this is a new promise, but I didn't really understand that. Yeah. And then I don't know that. Even now, like I'm not that young, and even now I feel like sometimes I watch, you or other pastors lead communion. Yeah. And I see it in new ways. I see it in simpler ways. I think maybe that's the heart of what I mean, is that the revelation for me is not that it gets more and more theologically complex. It's that it gets more and more simple, that it gets more and more pure, and like Jesus sitting around a table with his friends, and he's scared, and they're scared, and everything's falling apart all around him, and he's just like, listen, this is, at the very least, we have this moment. Yeah. At the very least, we have each other, and I want you to have me forever. I don't know what's going to happen, but man, I want this forever. I want this moment forever. Is there anything more about belonging than that? Anyway, you made me think about that.
No, I mean, that's the whole thing, right? Like, the simplicity of the table, the simplicity of baptism and water, right? Like everything about faith is meant to come down to, hey, can we share something here, right? Can we break some bread, have some wine, right? Have a conversation, share our joys, and also share those deepest places in us that are scared, right? That's what the table is all about. That's what a conversation should be about. That's what relationships are ultimately about. And when any of those break down in any sort of way, right? Think about a marriage, right? Like marriages break down because somewhere in there's a barrier, or someone's shut off, or someone is kind of overcoming the other person, and they're like, no, we both need to share, right? We both need to be in this space together. And if that can't happen, then things break down, right?
Yeah. That the idea that something so deeply Christian as communion, and everything around what it means and what it symbolizes, like there is so many layers of spiritual stuff, churchy stuff, religious stuff, so many layers packed on top of it. And the idea that there's a way to look at it anyway that is so human, so just pure, and so related to every real important thing in our life, our marriage or our partnership, our friendships, our relationship with our kids, our relationship with our parents or grandparents, our coworkers, like that could all, there's something that we can learn from communion, from that breaking of bread and that pouring of wine and that story. There's something that can be applied to all of those relationships. That's, I think, something that gets me continually excited about what we're trying to do with Between, about what this podcast and what this whole larger Between project is all about.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. We, in theology, we will talk about, Christ in creation or God in all things. And then we sort of take that as an abstract rather than going, so yeah, God's in the bread, right? God's in the wall. God's in that tree out there. God's in all of it, whether you call it God or being or energy or whatever, right? It's all flowing through one another. And then all of a sudden we get to this special place where we go, yes, this bread is the body of God, right? Because why isn't it the body of God, right?
Yeah.
Like, instead of asking, like, how is it the body of God, we go, well, how is it not? Isn't that tree part of that too?
Yeah.
Isn't me? Like, all these kinds of things. And so it's just then sending people back out the world and be like, oh, yeah, that's right. God is in me, right? Like, in some ways, I just sort of imbibed God, right?
Yeah.
And I can do that out there in the mountains. I can do that in the sacred texts, and I particularly do that in relationships with people.
Man, and that takes me to, I was sharing this with you earlier in conversation, and I sometimes stumble through this, so maybe you can help me, or maybe you can help me unpack it, or you can debate or whatever I need here. But
I prefer the stumbling, personally.
yeah, well, that's my normal default mode of transportation, stumbling, especially around faith stuff. But I think often that what we understand about God, what we understand about anything faith related, I think it was all born in interaction, in conversation. I'm not suggesting that we made up God in a conversation back long, long ago. Yeah. I'm suggesting that the only way we can understand God is through symbols and words and things that approximate what we mean. And the only way we've worked out those symbols and words and approximations is in the space between us, in our conversations. Yeah. And this is where I get the nerve to say that a conversation just like this conversation right now, where we're trying to figure out, like, learning a new way to understand communion, for example, or God or whatever. This is an example of where it was all from. This is it. There couldn't be anything more holy. This is creation, our understanding, right?
Every time.
And then maybe everything that we know about God and faith-related stuff is all trying to point us back to how to be better and better at these types of interactions, at this space, this human space.
Oh, for sure. Well, we particularly in the Western world, we worry about the way that we talk about these things, but particularly in the Eastern traditions, as well as just kind of in poetry and artistic language in general, right? You can talk about communion, right, and intimacy, and obviously there's sexual implications there that we begin to avoid in the Western world, right? But it all comes down to this word conception, right? We are conceiving. And you don't conceive on your own. You conceive with someone else or other people, right? And so that's all in there theologically, right? So if you go to Genesis 1, right? So once again, coming back to this sacred book for at least three traditions, right? There is God. And we think there's just God and there's nothing out there in the whole thing. But, like, there's a spirit of God hovering over these, like, chaotic, primordial waters, right? Well, that hovering language in and of itself has that implication as well. It's like very like, I am here, I am hovering, I'm fluttering, I'm doing all these things, and out of that comes this burst of language, right? Which for the rabbinical tradition, the rabbis, they go, this is not just sound, this is like song, right? Let there be light is a song of sorts, right? And that resonance happens, that conception happens, right? Like that's what happens in great conversations.
And if there's a voice, this is me going way over my pay grade, too deep into some theological waters, but man, if there's a voice there must be a hearer.
Be
if there's a mouth, there's an ear,
yes,
right? Like
exactly.
At least symbolically, as a story, that conception requires both ends of that communication spectrum, right? I think John starts his gospel with the word.
The word.
Right? And I'd love to explore in a really nerdy way the origins of that word and the like where that comes from in the Greek or the Hebrew or whatever. But man, I just get inspired by it when I read the word. The word became flesh. The word was like, oh, wait, there's an interchange. If there's a word, it has to have come from somewhere, and it has to be landing somewhere, and it's probably bouncing back, and there's an interchange. That gets me really excited to think about my next conversation, to think about my next interaction with my kids, to think about my next phone call or email with my coworkers, believe it or not, because it is full of words. Yeah. It is full of creation. Yeah. It is full of potential. And I get excited about that.
Well, and imagine how often we are inside of our own brains, right? Going a little crazy and nuts is the reality of it, because we have these ideas, we have these thoughts, and we just have to get them out. And until they're out, they're not flesh. They're not real. They're not anything. They're just things floating around inside of us. But the moment I name something or say something or have a word for it, right, describing something, then there's this interaction that begins to take place and something actually takes shape.
Yeah.
Right? That's the sacredness. That's the cool part of it all, right?
I've told you this before, but I'll share with our podcast listeners for what it's worth. My favorite professor in college, he was a communications theory professor. His name was Corey Anton. His name is Corey Anton. I still bump into his stuff on social media every once in a while. He's fantastic. And he was this kind of hippie, he blew my mind as a college student. He did not talk about things the way people who came from places like I came from talked about things. Man, I was like, wow, this guy. Anyway, I remember him talking about, he just dropped this, just a little nugget one day in the middle of, we were talking about something else entirely. And he talked about how, he was like, there's some philosophers who think that maybe the story of the apple and the story of quote unquote original sin is really just a story about language being evolved as humans evolved. When they started to get language, they could do something. Yes. They could name something else. Once I named that chair a chair, it no longer was part of the oneness that all we understood before was we were a part of everything until something else had a name and we could objectify things.
Yes.
And maybe the quote unquote original sin was us falling from the oneness by being able to name some other things that also meant we were naming ourselves separate.
Yes.
And becoming separate from the oneness. And man, that blew my mind. Like a 19-year-old kid in a communications class. I thought we were just talking about writing paragraphs. And that was probably a formative little. And then he moved on to Marshall McLuhan or whatever else we were studying at the time. And I remember thinking, whoa, you can think about faith that way. Like you could think about God that way. You can think about us that way. Anyway, and that's also informed, I think, a lot of how my theology has grown and how I understand how important our conversations can be.
Oh, for sure. Well, once again, in theology, everything is about distinction, right? And so Genesis 1 again, there's this separation between what is and chaos, right? And so God, in that story, God creates order out of the mess, right? God takes darkness and goes, let there be light, right? There's water, let there be land, right? And all these distinctions and separations and descriptions, right? And that's what we, particularly as human beings, are very good at. We're very good at saying, I'm going to describe something for good or for bad, right? And once again, back to your professor, that's what he's describing, that we name something as good or evil, right? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not, right? But yet in there is this generative quality that's taking place, and we do that throughout our entire lives, right? Think about how many things you've described and named as an 8-year-old versus a 40-some-year-old,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
and you go, oh, wait a minute, I see that differently now. And there's something sacred every time that we name. Once again, Genesis 2, God takes Adam, this first human being, right? And Adam is nothing more than a Hebrew word that means of the dirt, of the earth, right? So this being who has intelligence, who's from the earth, and goes, hey, name everything.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just start describing things, right? And once again, this language is so central to everything in those sacred texts.
Yeah. One of my biggest frustrations in the faith world is the limitations of language. Is that we can't even, if I pick a word, let's pick the big one. Let's pick God.
Yeah.
That word, first of all, in the Bible, in Genesis, in the first 4 chapters of Genesis, aren't there 2 or 3 different?
There are 3 different words for God in the first 2 chapters.
And that's been around for, several thousand years, and we still can't agree. And if I say God and you say God, we're talking about different things. This is both
every time
frustrating and wonderfully inspiring.
Yes.
And something that is so fascinating. I love to learn what other people mean when they say that word, when they say God, or when they say, pick a faith-related word, when they say it. I want to know, what do you... I feel like I've been diving into the word Christ on a whole new level. Every time I dive back into Richard Rohr's work, or I dive back into some of the sort of desert fathers, these old, or even just modern sort of mystics that I'm following on Instagram, and I'm learning the word Christ means something to me. What it meant to me 3 years ago was a dramatically different thing than what it means to me today. And how frustrating and how beautiful and how wonderful, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, these are the things, right? So that first word in Hebrew scripture for God is Elohim, right? Which is an ancient Canaanite word for God that comes out of their mythology, right? And because all sacred things are actually between people, right? So it emerged in conversations from this probably 4,000 to 5,000 old cultural group, right? And then they were mixing with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians go, well, we have a very different word for that, and the Babylonians have a different word for that, and obviously the Greeks and the Romans had different words for that, right? And as all that is mixing, all of their faith and theology is mixing as well, right? And then you turn over the next page, and all of a sudden God's no longer Elohim, God's this sacred name, which for the Jewish people, we're not even supposed to say that name, right? But it's YHWH, right? It's Yahweh, 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 depending on how you want to pronounce it. But it's a whole different word that just means I am. It means being, right? And it's all of these are sitting there, and by the time you get through the first 10 chapters of Genesis, you've now encountered about 7 different names for God.
Yeah, that's wild. That's wildly frustrating and wonderful. And it also, and those old cultures mix with our new and ever new cultures here. Yeah. And when we say cultures, it's one thing to say mixes with American culture, or mixes with Western culture, but then mixes with suburban Colorado culture, where you and I are sitting right now, mixes with Eastern Kentucky, Appalachian culture, mixes with Indiana, small town Indiana culture, small town Michigan culture, the places where we're from, and the way it manifests with what those words mean within the culture, within the cultural uses of the language limitations. Of course, we've got this wide diversity of faith understandings.
Yeah, huge, right? And this is where people get all kind of wrapped around the axle around religion and God, and wanting to know if you mean the same thing as they do, right? And it's why is that the transaction, right? Why is it me going, do you agree with me, instead of going wow, tell me more.
Yes.
Let's explore. Let's be curious. Let's get into why you think differently, and not even so much think, why are you different?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, I become different.
Yeah, man. There is no line between what a person thinks, what a person believes, and what a person is.
Right.
Those are all the same. Those are all the same mixing of stuff that makes a person a person. And to encounter that, to like really encounter that in a conversation, in a real, authentic, curious conversation, and allow it to mix with all the stuff that makes your beliefs and things you think and the things you are, and to let those things be together is the human experience. That's what I think.
Oh, yeah. It's one of the things when I'm working with someone who is trying to figure out themselves and their faith, right? And I'll go, so what do you believe? And they'll give me a litany or list of stuff that they think they believe. And I go, okay, let's ask different questions, right? Like, what do you think about that human being over there, right? Like, tell me fundamentally, just give me the state of being of them, right? Yeah. And it's a hard thing to get into, but once you start exploring it, people go, wait a minute, what I think I believe and what I really believe are kind of different, right?
Yeah.
Because you grow up thinking there's this list of stuff that I'm supposed to believe or that you're not supposed to believe, right? But the reality of it is the way that we live, if we begin describing it like an anthropologist, right, they'd go, actually, here's what your life says about you, right, and what you think the world is, right? Yeah. And that's the space where people actually go, oh, wow, like I had no idea I believed this stuff.
What if there was a test for me? What if there was a test for me that was, okay, name the top 10 things you believe, right? Write them down.
Right.
Now I'm gonna watch you for a week, and I'm gonna observe a few things. I'm gonna observe the side comments you make about other people to other people. I'm gonna observe how much care, attention, eye contact, focus, compassion you demonstrate in encounters with people at the grocery store. I'm going to observe how you spend your money, how you don't spend your money, how you give away your money. I'm just going to observe it. This is not judging. This is not saying there's a right way and a wrong way. This is about comparing what you say you believe and what you believe. Totally. Because what you must believe is what you must be doing. Exactly. What you must have done last Tuesday. Yes. That's what you believe, right? Yeah. And that's a really difficult thing to encounter, particularly because a lot of people have been taught that there is a right way that will get you into heaven and a wrong way that will, and there's a lot of wrong ways that'll get you not into heaven and probably into some place that's warm and uncomfortable. And that is really scary for people to confront the reality of their lived beliefs.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when you look at my life, I must believe in going places because I'm always on the go, right? Like I'm in the car all the time, right? Going from one place to another. Whereas for other cultures, like staying and being in one place is really, really important.
Yeah.
Right. And if someone asked me like, hey, do you think being where you're at's important? I'd go, oh yeah, sure. But then you observe my life and go, no, he believes that being on the go is actually what fuels his life, right? And then if I actually get to the end of that and go, well, I don't want to be that person, then I have to make some changes, right?
Yeah. For me, you're a deeply loving father to your son, and I often think the easiest place for somebody to see the difference between what I believe and what I say I believe is in the way that I parent when I'm tired, when I'm grumpy, when I'm busy, when I just got a stressful email or whatever. Yeah. And what I say I believe is in patience and in unconditional love and in attention over everything and in all those things. And then what it looks like I believe is impatience and work before family and snapping at your kids is a perfectly okay thing to do because you're tired and there's some justification for it, right? Like that's what it looks like, I believe. Yes. It's not what I would say or what I would hope other people would describe, but man, there's a reality in that.
There's a reality there.
That becomes a really concentrated exploration of who you are, and also the invitation to who you can be.
Yes. Well, and I think that's where you come back to conversations are sacred, right? Like it's conversations between people, but it's conversations even between two aspects of yourself or two ideas or two things. Like the moment you set up these things, you go, oh, I actually want to be over here. So how do I get there, right? Well, that is a holy thing.
Yes.
Right? Like I want to change. I want to transform, right? That's a holy, holy thing. And it only happens through interaction.
Yeah. I find myself in all the work that we're doing with Between, I find myself constantly drawn to what is the most simple, practical, real life, everyday application I can assume most people need help with, right? And I feel like I love nerding out with you about, the many words for God in Genesis, right?
Right.
But what that conversation is actually about for me is when I disagree with my neighbor about politics, when my neighbor flies a flag out of their house because it's election year next year, and that flag is like offensive, to me, it's hurtful or it's scary. Yeah. What that conversation about many words for God is about is not about many words for God. It's about many different lived experiences that, my neighbor has a whole different life that he's lived and a whole different set of fears that he has that drive his life, that motivate him. He's got a whole different set of priorities, a whole different family background, right? Like all those things. And me understanding that is his language difference. He literally speaks a different language than me, even if we're neighbors and we speak the exact same version of English.
Right.
His life is a different language.
Yes.
And me being curious, instead of me just being mad at the flag that he flies, me being curious about what's he afraid of or what's he hopeful for that makes him fly it, I think is the test for me. And the one that I struggle with. Like, let me be clear. I'm bad at this stuff. And I think that's why I'm as bad as anybody else anyway. And and I think that's why I want to help people with it. I want to talk to people about it because I think those are the real struggles of our real life that I actually believe faith, your faith and my faith and anybody's faith can actually help us with. I think it's supposed to help us with those conflicts, those challenges, those opportunities for connection that too often result in disconnection, in loneliness, in separation, and in real negative conflict.
Yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, we're living in an epidemic of loneliness, right? And we're partly lonely because we are further and further divided into these very narrowly described tribes in the world, right? Yeah. And so you walk out and you see your neighbor and you go, either I don't know you at all, right? Or the things that I do know about you, I'm afraid of.
Yes.
Right? Or I know that maybe I'm the weird guy and you're going to be afraid of me, right? Like all of that plays into all of this, right? And so as a pastor at a church, I'm constantly reminding our people, this is a big tent, this is a big table. None of us have the same beliefs in the room.
Yeah.
Right. And we love that about ourselves, right? Like that's actually a great thing. And the fear can start to subside if we can help people practice a little curiosity.
That is a really powerful thing you said. So this recording may end up being a little echoey. It may end up the audio may be a little weird. It's because we're sitting inside the sanctuary of your church, of Grace Presbyterian Church in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. And you just said we all believe different things. Like sitting in here, I look around at these chairs. I imagine all these chairs filled on Christmas Eve, probably multiple services. There's a bunch of people who are going to come here. And you just said, this is a really powerful thing. Yeah. You just said, everybody who comes to my church believes something different.
They do. Yeah. Even those who have even very similar beliefs, they're different between that individual and the person sitting next to them, right? Spouses and partners sitting next to one another. they know they have different beliefs, actually, right? Like we know with the people that we love the most that actually that person thinks very differently than me, right?
Yeah.
And yet there's something common that's held, right? And that commonality, once you break it down, really isn't some intellectual litany of belief, right? It's this idea that coming together and all coming into a space that we've deemed holy and sacred is the sacred thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's the stuff. And maybe, just maybe, the fact that you are different than me is the very thing that I need to connect with this thing we call God.
The coming together is the sacred thing. You just made me think, my wife and I just had a little sort of date weekend trip. We went on a short little trip, little getaway. And at some point, randomly during that trip, I don't even remember the context of the conversation, the details don't matter, but at some point we actually had a real conversation about, do you consider yourself, maybe we didn't frame it this way, it was like, how do you relate to the word Christian? Or how do you relate to the idea of the label of Christianity or being a Christian?
Totally.
And it was such a cool conversation. And I thought, like, I do this, often. I have a podcast about it, and that is not a normal conversation for my wife and I to have, right? Like, I imagine how many 95% of couples out there, or of people who are intimate with each other as friends or as parents or siblings.
Yeah.
I've never really had that conversation about, like, what's your relationship with the labels of faith or with the experience of faith, right?
Yeah.
And because that's a really complex conversation. It's layered, and there's baggage, and there's guilt, and there's shame or assumed shame. Yeah. But what a cool thing. I want to turn back to you. You said maybe the sacred thing is when all these people come back into this room, into this sanctuary, because they don't all believe the same thing.
Yes.
Maybe that's the sacred thing.
That's the beauty of the whole thing. That's the magic, right? Like we know when we're on top of a mountain, this is miraculous in some way, right? We take for granted that when we get together in groups that it's magical as well, right? It wasn't too very long ago in evolutionary history where you put more than 12 people in a room, someone was going to die.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like literally, like human beings have not been good at grouping for very long, right? And so when you start stacking people on one another, what happens, right? Our tension, our stress levels, our anxiety goes up, right? Evolutionary processes inside of us tell us, I don't know every person in here, right? But what that also sets us up for is this other piece of going, you're right, I am not aware of everyone in here, and I may discover something new.
Yeah.
And so there's this fear side of it, but there's also this like wonder side of it. And wonder and fear almost always dwell in the exact same space. It's just a choice of how we react.
I like that you said it's a choice, because I think it's fear wins in a battle, in a straight up battle.
Oh yeah. Every time.
Between fear and wonder, fear wins every single time.
Yeah.
Fear is so easy. It's such an easy victory. It's such an easy, it's a magnet. It sucks us all to it, right?
Our brains are designed for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We want to avoid fear. We want to avoid, and
we want to live.
Yeah. But if we choose wonder, if we choose curiosity, if we choose to, when the neighbor's flying the flag that's not our favorite flag, or when the person is just entering our space and they're new, if we choose wonder, man, maybe that's what we're called to do. Maybe that's what it's about.
Well, you're choosing surviving versus thriving in all those circumstances, right? Like choosing fear, which is the easy one, is going, I want to survive. Yeah. But at some point you go, I don't want to just survive. Yeah. I want something more. And that requires going, well, I guess I'm going to step into this place that is scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, that's fun. That's real fun.
Which comes back to conversations, right?
Yes.
The reality is another human being is scary.
Yeah.
Right? And
so we avoid it most of the time.
We avoid it.
We spend most of our life avoiding it. We're making it as short as possible. We're making it as surface level as possible because it's really scary.
Yes.
And giving somebody information about ourselves, telling you something vulnerable about myself, or being real with you for a second about my fears or the things that I'm worried about or I'm really hopeful for, that can be used against us. Of course, people are afraid. Of course they are. And maybe I think the way I understand my faith is that it calls me to want abundance. It calls me to want a full and whole life. It calls me to want to live vibrantly and to experience everything in this creation. It calls me to want to wonder and to be drawn into the wonder and to reject the fear because I'm probably pretty safe. I'm probably going to be okay.
I'll probably survive.
Yeah. And as it turns out, that person over there is a magical, magnificent creation that is something that I've never encountered before. And if I choose to encounter, wow, I could be, my life could change.
Well, I was at a Christmas party on Saturday night. My kid got invited to this house over in Parker has a giant light show, right? Yeah. And invited everyone from his class, right? So we walk in. Obviously, a few people know one another, but most of us do not know one another. All the kids do. Right, but the adults are like, who knows, right? It was me, my wife, and my father. So I was pretty safe. I got two other people to talk to, right? I don't really have to talk to anyone else. Well, there's this woman who's the mother of one of the kids in my son's class, and she's kind of floating on the edge, right? And at some point, I just make contact with her long enough for us to say, hey, hello, my name is, right? And we entered in a conversation, right? Well, we ended up talking, my dad and my wife, me and her, the rest of the evening, right? And you connect and you find out, oh, well, you're about to go on a Christmas trip to Poland because that's where your husband's family's from, right? Yeah. And then we start talking about Ukraine and what's it like being Polish and having that in your backyard, right? And, the full circle of conversation ends up going all the way back to when she meets her husband, right? He's a military guy, all these kinds of things, right? And what does it mean to live on base or not live on base, right? And I mean, things that I never thought going to a Christmas party that I'm going to have a conversation around, right? It was interesting and fun, and I learned stuff, right?
Not to make you the hero of that story.
I'm not. She is, actually. She's the one who actually said, hey.
Really? That's cool.
Yes, totally.
To me, that feels like, that is the microcosm of what we're doing.
Yes.
Right? There are people floating around the edges of everybody's life.
Yes.
There are people floating around the edges everywhere. And all of us crave belonging, which makes us feel safe, which reduces the fear that keeps us floating on the outside. And so somebody has to break the ice. Somebody has to reach across. Somebody has to invite that person in. Belonging is such a, it's such a tossed around term.
It is.
It's such a, I sometimes roll my eyes at the idea of belonging. But then I don't when I dive into it because it's everything.
It's everything.
It's really everything. I mean, we are all still walking into our middle school lunchrooms with a tray full of food, looking around to see what table would let us sit there. Right?
Exactly.
We're all still there. And if we can find ways to invite people in, just for a moment, to make them feel safe,
totally.
That's I think that's church.
That's church. That's sacred. That's what it's all about right there, right? People judge churches on how friendly they are, and they should.
They should. Heck
they should. Yes. Every time, right? Like if you're walking into a group of people and they are not friendly and accepting, find a different group of people, right? Like, or you become the person who's the friendly and accepting human being who includes other people.
Hey, thanks to all you betweeners out there for listening to this episode of the Between Podcast. Make sure you visit between.church on the internet to sign up for our mailing list. That's probably the most important thing, our email list. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. You can check out our 5-minute sermons, 5-ish minute sermons that we post every week. Follow us on social media. We got daily prayers. We got all sorts of other content. And join our community fully. We invite everyone. You are welcome here, no matter who you are or where you're from, no matter what you believe or even if you believe, no matter who you love or how you love, no matter what anybody else has ever told you about you. You are welcome and loved and celebrated here at Between. You know, my favorite church is the space between people. Now go with God's love and create the church between.